Good afternoon, everyone following us from Europe and Africa, and good morning to those on the other side of the Atlantic. I'm Matteo Pugliese, an ISPI Associate Research Fellow and a PhD candidate at the University of Barcelona. This ISPI online meeting is part of a year-long initiative and a series of virtual events co-organized with prestigious international organizations ahead of the 7th edition of the MED Dialogues, which will be held from the 2nd to the 4th of December 2021, hopefully in person in Rome. Today, we will try to shed light on a topic that Western media rarely mention unless it's part of the news regarding a terrorist attack in Europe or, unfortunately, the death of Western soldiers deployed in Africa. I'm referring to the future of ISIS and the current situation in Iraq and Syria following the collapse of the so-called caliphate and the ISIS strategy of adaptation for survival in that scenario, but also the expansion of the Islamic State in Africa, establishing new provinces and a network of affiliated groups. In fact, this panel will also take into account the perspective of the EU involvement in Africa with its military interventions alongside Sahelian partners to tackle the jihadist insurgency, which threatens regional stability and might create new safe havens for terrorists. We will discuss all of this with 3 experts. So let me introduce our speakers. Delina Goxho, she's a PhD candidate on security force assistance and military intervention at the Scuola Normale Superiore of Pisa. Rida Lyammouri, who is senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South, and Dr. Aaron Zelin, who is Richard Borough Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and also author of the book Your Sons Are at Your Service to DJ's Missionaries of Jihad. So I'd like to remind our panelists that we have a limited time for 2 rounds of debate plus the Q&A session from the public. So our viewers are invited to ask questions to the panelists. So let me briefly recap the topic. Between July and October 2017, both Mosul and Raqqa were liberated thanks to the joint efforts of the Iraqi security forces and militias, the airstrikes from the global coalition, and the SDF ground forces in Syria. We had to wait until March 2019 to see the last stand of Baghouz, where the Euphrates crosses the border into Iraq, while in October 2019, the then leader of ISIS, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, was killed by American special forces in northwestern Syria. Despite many politicians and media talk about the end of ISIS, we should be aware that the group still exists and is actually shaping a new global strategy. Indeed, tactical success in Iraq and Syria against terrorist groups do not defeat terrorism as a whole. Although, of course, wiping out ISIS militants from towns is, of course, an achievement. ISIS militants keep targeting both Syrian and Iraqi forces in the desert. And according to Iraqi intelligence, the new leader of ISIS, al-Hashimi al-Qurashi, whose real name is Amir Muhammad Said al-Salbi al-Mawla from the Nineveh area, might be hiding in Syria. This brings me to the first set of questions to Aaron Zelin. Aaron, how the Islamic State has adapted in the aftermath of the fall of the so-called caliphate in Iraq and Syria. Does the motto remaining and expanding still express the strategy of the organization, or the new leader is shaping a different path? Some say that ISIS has gone back to a decentralized approach with more autonomy for the local units. Also, what's the current role of the international community against ISIS, especially in Iraq? And what are the implications of the sectarian violence between Shia, Sunni, and Kurds in the fight against this threat? Please, Aaron.
Thank you. Good afternoon to everybody in Italy and Europe, and morning to everybody in the US and Canada. Yeah, so one of the things that's important to note is that even before ISIS lost its territorial control in both Iraq and Syria, they were already messaging that they were going to return to sort of this strategy that they previously had, sort of in the 2009 to 2012 time period, after sort of the surge of troops that the US brought into Iraq and the tribal awakening in Iraq, essentially returning to an insurgency instead of being sort of this proto-state actor. And as a consequence, much of what's been going on since the fall of Baghouz in March 2019 has been related to that. They're essentially playing the same playbook because they see it as a success, because for them, this is a long-term struggle, because they know that whether many politicians in the West or even potentially locally can be fickle at times. So as a result, they're playing the long game in many regards. That being said, if you look at sort of the activity of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, let's say in the past year, for example, they've actually not been as active as they had been in the prior year before that, which suggests that at least the campaign against the group in both Iraq and Syria is maintaining some pressure on the organization. Of course, unlike some politicians who have claimed that the group is defeated, that's not the case. But we're not at a scenario yet where some more sensationalist media has argued that there's this resurgence of ISIS in Iraq and Syria. That's just not the case yet. So it is still there, but we shouldn't be like thinking about this in the same way that we saw this in, say, like 2014 or 15, around that time period. In terms of the one question related to some of the dynamics between the various actors, if you look at Iraq in particular, that seam region sort of between where the Kurdistan region is, where sort of there's this weird delegation of actions between the Iraqi army versus the Shia militias that sort of Iran controls. That's actually where ISIS is able to operate the most, sort of this diamond region between Kirkuk, Salahuddin, North Baghdad, and Diyala, because there sort of is this question of who is really in charge of this fight in this area. Whereas the historical areas where ISIS has been strongest, like Nineveh and Anbar, they're actually not quite as strong in terms of their activity level. As for Syria, it's mainly in the lower Euphrates River Valley, which again is sort of this seam region because many of the Arab tribes are in that area, but the Kurds control the region, and therefore there are these tensions between what the Kurds are attempting to do with their governance model versus what the Arab tribes are hoping to have more sort of independence and between them. So as a result, ISIS is able to operate in that location. But we also see them sort of having some small level of activity too in areas where the Assad regime is acting in the Homs desert region. I'll leave it there since I know time is limited.
Thanks a lot, Aaron. Actually, I will come back to you to talk a bit more about North Africa and the situation of ISIS there. But ISIS, as I said, is not operating only in the Mashreq and the Levant region, but is also expanding in the African continent, from the Mediterranean coast to Central Africa, with various regional branches and affiliated groups. There are some more consolidated branches, like the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, which is operating in the Sahel region, especially in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. The Islamic State in West Africa, especially in Nigeria and the Lake Chad Basin, but also the Islamic State in Central Africa province. There are some new reports about the presence in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Mozambique, but they still have to be verified. There are some initial reports about that. The US State Department designated those groups as affiliated to ISIS. In this regard, I'd like to ask Rida Lyammouri, how do you assess the presence of the Islamic State in the African continent, in particular in the Sahel and the sub-Saharan region? What is the difference between the strategy of ISIS as core ISIS in the Levant and its branches in Africa? What are the social and economic and political root causes that foster the recruitment in that region of new militants, especially in the Sahel? And what are the ethnic dynamics involved in this? Because I think they're pretty different from the dynamics that led many militants to join the organization in Iraq and Syria. Also, the Islamic State is the only threat, or there are multiple threats to the stability of those countries? What about the Al-Qaeda affiliated groups and the role of ethnic groups like Fulani people? Rida, please.
Thank you, Matteo, and good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I will just start with the last question. I think that, of course, before the arrival of the Islamic State to the region, to the Sahel region, and to the Lake Chad Basin, AQ-affiliated groups have been already implemented in the area since early mid-2000s and going forward all the way to today. The group have been transformed, but remain a threat, and they remain have a strong presence in the Sahel region. The arrival of the Islamic State in 2015 have been seen as maybe a little bit of overstretch of the group, and including myself, doubted that they will achieve what they have achieved to this day. So we can say that today, where the group in the region is much stronger than it was when we were created in 2015, and even a couple of years ago. And despite what we can tell about the Islamic State in the region, for the Sahel region at least, despite facing major pressure from the French and allies in the region, in the Sahel, we can see that they showed capability of adaptation, of being adapted, and also looking for areas where they can tap into and create what we call a marriage of convenience. And that answers your question about how they could identify areas where they could regroup, establish contacts with local communities, integrate themselves in those communities by benefiting from also existing economic interest. And when I say economic interest, with the existing criminal networks that they can build ties with, these criminal networks often have strong connections to local communities and a very strong supply chain of all sorts of trafficking. And the Islamic State have demonstrated this, especially in recent months or a couple of years, now as they are stretching into northern Benin on the borders between Niger, Burkina Faso, as well as recent information, also some presence of like small members in northern Ghana. So they are demonstrating this capability of tapping into those local communities, playing that card, as you mentioned, of working with communities that are being victimized or stigmatized by either national or international forces, international community, and they are able to do that. And also, what they have demonstrated recently as well is they are using more brutal violence against civilians, against communities that publicly announced that they will stand up against them, that they will collaborate with security forces. And we have seen this since January of this year in Tillabéri region of Niger, where leaders of the Islamic State of Greater Sahara, who are members from the same community, called attacks against civilians from his same community, because they decided to establish local militias and to counter the presence of the Islamic State in that area. So we can't say with certainty there is one community that is supportive of the Islamic State or not. I think they accept everyone from every different community as long as they support them. But of course, they try to tap into other communities, and we are seeing this as well in the part of Niger, in Tawa region, where there is a strong presence of more of the Arab communities and Tuareg communities, but they are able to also build ties there. So to go to your back to your last question, while the Islamic State is going more towards the east side of West Africa, along the borders between Niger and Burkina Faso, where they are continuing to expand further south, the GNM, which is the regional branch of Al-Qaeda, have demonstrated expansion more towards northern Cote d'Ivoire on northern Guinea, and in that area on the borders with Burkina Faso and Mali. So the question, I don't have the answer. I don't know if they are trying to avoid each other, but I think they are working on their strengths and when they have more established local brigades than trying to compete with each other. On the Lake Chad, I think the recent event with the killing of the dying of Shekau, I think it remains to be seen. And as Vincent Faucher, who's a specialist in the region, have mentioned, there are ongoing talks between the remaining brigades and commanders of Boko Haram and trying to join forces with the Islamic State in West Africa province. And I think that is the alarming part of this transformation and something to watch very closely and really alarming to regional forces as well as the international community.
Thanks a lot, Rida, for this overview and details about the Sahel scenario. Actually, this is very much connected to what Delina Goxho is studying, including the European military intervention in the Sahel region and the political strategy led by France for supporting the local governments in their fight against terrorism and insurgency, which was often criticized as controversial due to the support for some authoritarian regimes or non-democratic leaders sometimes. Delina, can you tell us more about this? Because I feel most of the public doesn't know much about the current involvement of the European Union and the West in general in the Sahel region. And in particular, can you give us an overview about the G5 Sahel and the commitment on regional security? Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Grazie, Matteo. And hello, everyone. It's very nice to be here today. My colleagues have very well elucidated what is taking place with armed groups in the wider region. I would be focusing primarily on military interventions to tackle such threats and perhaps make a connection between the European governments have chosen to intervene in the Sahel and the limits to such an approach. But because this conversation is split in two, it would make sense to tackle this second bit later. I think it also makes sense to present a few avenues forward, something that may be of interest, not just interlocutors in Brussels and Paris, but also in Rome, given that Italy will be more and more involved in the Sahel in the years to come, I suppose, and hopefully not just from a migration point of view. So the discussion here today is about the evolving threat of armed groups in the wider Mediterranean region, and how armed groups are evolving, alliances shifting or avoiding each other. But I don't know that we can say the same of the way that we are intervening. The way we're intervening seems to be quite stable, and it seems to not change particularly in the last few years. So Western forces have shifted in the past few decades from a type of approach that could have been deemed conventional warfare, from that to air campaigns, to counterinsurgency operations like Iraq and Afghanistan, or peacekeeping operations like, for example, with Kosovo, Lebanon, and Mali. And we use this type of warfare, and the way academia is calling it now is remote warfare. This type of warfare is used to counter threats at a distance, without deploying large numbers of our own military personnel to the front lines. Battles tend to be increasingly fought through a combination of drone and airstrikes, the use of special forces, intelligence operatives, in some cases private military contractors, and military advisors who provide security force assistance. This shift is interesting for us because it is what the EU is doing with its, for example, training mission to Mali, EUTM Mali, but also elsewhere. And this is, of course, what European countries are also doing in Libya. We do this within a framework of stabilization, especially as EU, but also within a framework of counterterrorism operations, which is what's happening with France in the Sahel. And I think all of this needs to be problematized, and this is why it's, I believe, particularly interesting to mention the Sahel in this context, because politicians and the military in a number of European states, but also in the US, are very much keen to present remote warfare as an alternative to conventional military deployments because of the difficulties associated with the post-9/11 wars on terror. So this is presented in Niger, in Mali, in Chad, in Burkina, as a low-cost and low-risk form of warfare. And this is problematic because of one example I will make, and then we can expand on this later. There was one recent case of a French Mirage strike, which struck in Mali from intelligence deriving from a drone. In a place, in a non-urban location in Bunti, in Mali, in which 19 civilians were killed. This took place in March this year, and we are seeing now, as Europeans, exactly what we have been seeing all along the Obama administration wars on terror. There was, following the strike, a denial that civilians were killed on the part of the French administration. There were rumors that Bunti people that spoke up, they had been trained by foreign agents, and that there was this urgency argument being presented, and the argument goes like this: because there is a huge security threat, then we must behave in exceptional ways. But I believe these type of interventions are much more problematic than we make them to be, not just because they strengthen authoritarian leaders in very many Sahel countries, but also because we end up making mistakes that we are unwilling to admit, precisely because these interventions are remote. So we can talk about this later if you want.
Thanks, Delina. You gave us very interesting details. And before I ask a second round of questions to the panelists, let me remind our viewers that they can ask questions related to the topic, and I'll pass it on to our speakers. So after this analysis, I'd like our panelists to focus on the future challenges and maybe some policy recommendation or ideas and proposals on how the international community could contribute to improve effectively the fight against ISIS and terrorism in general in the MENA region in Africa. So I come back to you, Aaron. You studied the jihadist presence not only in Iraq and Syria, but also in Tunisia. So what changed there after the fall of the caliphate, and more in general in North Africa? I mean, not just in Tunisia. Tunisia, as you wrote in your book, was pretty much connected to what happened in Libya. So what about the ISIS presence in that region, in Libya, in the Sinai region? Please.
Yeah, so, most of these discussions, we usually are talking about something bad going on. If you look at what's been happening in Tunisia and Libya, for example, though, over the past few years, you could actually view it, for now at least, as a success story. In the last year, there's only been one attack by ISIS in Tunisia, and over the last 2 years in Libya, there have only been 2 attacks there. Obviously, nobody wants any attacks, but compared to how things used to be, where there were, a bunch of large-scale attacks against civilians in Tunisia and then ISIS controlling territory in Libya, there's been a big change in just the last 5 years. Part of that, in the case of Libya, is that, as you alluded to, many of the senior leaders with ISIS in Libya were actually Tunisians, as well as other foreign fighters from places like Egypt and Sudan. So when the organization in Libya was degraded, it was a lot harder for them to continue to operate, since many of the foreigners were either killed or returned back home. And as a consequence, there have been some encampments here and there in sort of the central southern region of Libya, where ISIS has tried to start rebuilding itself, but every time it has tried to attempt to do more, either the US has been involved in some form of airstrikes, or local forces have attacked them, and therefore they've been relatively suppressed. In the context of Tunisia, which, has an actual central government, they've implemented a number of reforms over the last few years in relation to its military as well as law enforcement to be more discriminate and focus on the jihadists themselves instead of sort of what we saw prior to 2011 in the revolution, which was sort of casting a wide net. And as a consequence, over time, they've been able to zero in on both ISIS and AQIM actors in the mountains near Algeria. And while you still see some landmine attacks here and there, overall, most of what we see now in Tunisia is homegrown plots. It's not connected to anything in Libya or Syria anymore. And therefore, it's not as large as it used to be. That being said, there is a large population of Tunisians in prisons because of all of the activism right after the uprising with Ansar al-Sharia. And then later, of course, the foreign fighter flows to both Libya and Syria. So if you look at sort of more medium to longer term issues, that's something I think people question in terms of sustainability of that, just because there still remains work to be done in terms of rehabilitation, reintegration type schemes within Tunisia itself. Of course, the continued economic issues as well as COVID over the last year have complicated things, and those are sort of the most immediate concerns now compared to security as that was more 5 years ago. But I think because of the fact that Tunisia is a democracy, unlike any other Arab states, they do have the capacity through their civil society to potentially do more and work at the local level instead of it just being a completely nationalized strategy, since they do have municipal political infrastructure. So that's one area where I think would be strongest, because if you look at the recruitment of most of these individuals, while they have sort of these national or transnational narratives they feed into, a lot of it's based originally on local conditions where individuals are operating. So I think that that's really important to think about, especially in the context of Tunisia. If we sort of look back at Iraq and Syria, I think one of the biggest contingencies is the question of the US's continued space there. Whether the US decides to remain in Iraq and Syria or decides to withdraw. Obviously, we've seen the US beginning to withdraw troops from Afghanistan and what that might mean in terms of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. But we've already seen sort of what happened in 2009, 2010 when the US withdrew from Iraq originally, and how that created a space for ISIS to reemerge, because the Iraqi state didn't necessarily have the same capacities to continue to suppress ISIS as it had when the US was there. And this also leads into what we discussed earlier in relation to sort of this sectarian issue, where we've seen these Shia militias that are connected to Iran. They really haven't learned that much from the past. We've seen them clearing out Sunni areas, and therefore there are these tensions which could lead to grievances in the future. And then in the Syrian theater, we also see that if the US did leave there, that would then provide a platform for Iran to take over the other part of eastern Syria. And then more in the northern part, it's likely that Turkey's proxy forces would take over too. And therefore, none of this would necessarily be in the interests of the US, the West, the international community, because it would definitely create more space again for ISIS to operate. And that's sort of what they're counting on, that many of the politicians in the US and the West will be fickle, and therefore they'll be given a chance to breathe again. And unlike, say, 6 or 7 years ago, if you're looking at US foreign policy, a lot of it's focused more or being pushed more in the direction of Asia, in particular because of China. So you might not see the same type of reaction that we saw maybe in 2014 if something happened again in, say, 2023 or 2024. So it's definitely something to be aware about and understand.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate your optimistic spirit about Tunisia and the possible reaction of the West. Rida, you told us about the Sahel situation. You also named the expansion of ISIS in other West African countries. Can you elaborate a bit more about the parallel threat in the Lake Chad Basin posed by the Islamic State in West Africa and the clashes with what rest of Boko Haram? There are reports about the killing of the leader of Boko Haram, Shekau, and how the ongoing also political instability in Mali and Chad is benefiting the jihadist insurgency in the region. And the last question for this round is: what is the French-led strategy really working in the Sahel? And if not, what could be a possible alternative strategy? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. For the threats about the ongoing the transformation of the groups on Lake Chad Basin, as I mentioned earlier, I think it does not definitely join forces between the remaining of Boko Haram and ISWAP is not in favor of the national, regional, and international forces because they're just going to be much stronger. They're going to be controlling more areas. Also, ISWAP, if becomes the main player, which continuing to be the case. Looks like ISWAP is going to be the major force in Lake Chad Basin. They have a more long-term goals compared to Boko Haram. Like, for example, they have a strategy on how to build good relationship with local communities and avoid targeting the Muslim population of Nigeria, for example, compared to Boko Haram, who consider the Muslim population living under the Nigerian government as traitors, and they are not believers, which has been one of the key differences between Boko Haram and ISWAP. And if ISWAP managed to convince the remaining of Boko Haram to follow that route, we can see that the ties with locals will continue to grow, and it will be much difficult for not just in terms of counterterrorism and security, but also the return of the state and the state's relevant authorities, related authorities, to return to these areas where they have been almost absent, and have little presence or have no ties with this community. So any efforts for the return is going to be much difficult than it was in the past. For the second question about what's going on in Chad and Mali, I think it doesn't. We cannot exaggerate and say that ISWAP and ISGS in the Sahel, including Al-Qaeda affiliates, GNM, that will benefit from what's going on. But definitely, it does disrupt local governments and their international partners from the ongoing counterterrorism efforts and other stabilization efforts. You can see that the security, for example, in Mali, security forces now will be more concerned about the political turmoil in Bamako rather than trying to find ISGS or GNM in central and northern Mali or across the borders. In addition to also the G5 Sahel, the struggle with that the force faced to establish itself as a major force. And now with the Chadians, the questions remain with the Chadians if they are going to remain as part of the Sahel G5 force in the Liptako-Gourma region, which is the tri-border area between Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, or they are going to return in Chad. So this how things will turn out in Chad will affect the role of the Chadian troops among the Sahel G5 force, in addition to the role within the peacekeeping mission in Mali, MINUSMA. So while in the short term and right now does not affect strongly the activities of the VEOs or jihadists in the region, if it persists, I think it might have an impact on them. But also this sends the turmoil, for example, that happening in Bamako, it just sends the wrong message to communities that are living under territories occupied by jihadist groups. As we know, some communities already negotiating with jihadist groups. They negotiated on certain some peace accords, and then this just gives more legitimacy to the state and gives legitimacy to armed actors, because they're saying, well, look, the government that says that they are protecting you or trying to provide for you, they are fighting. They continue to fight over political power and then concerned about power in the capital, while things continue to get bad in your areas where there are no public services. The question about the French strategy, I mean, it's harsh to say at this point that it has failed. But I think definitely has accomplished certain things. And the question is, what about if they weren't there? What would be the situation? I think it's fair to say that they have accomplished some success, but it's also fair to say it's been very limited, and the current situation and capability of these groups to expand, I think it also sends the wrong message and saying that the current strategy is not 100% working, and it's not. It needs to be. We need to rethink that strategy, and that goes to the point that Delina made about the bounty, for example. I think local and international partners, including French, has to do everything to avoid any human rights violations. And when things happen like that, like when civilians are killed, it's okay to assume responsibility, because to send the message that we are here to protect you. And of course, things happen, but you have to admit that. You have to show that leadership. And because they haven't shown that, they continue to make excuses for what happened at Bounty. You can see those demonstrations that are asking the French to leave, etc. And when you talk to French officials, they say, we can't release the video of the attack because it's classified. But then months earlier, when they killed the EQIM leader, Drukdel, they released the video. So the argument is you pick and choose what to release, what not to release. And when you decide not to release this video, then there is something questionable there. And the Malians are aware of that, and local populations are becoming increasingly aware of this strategy. And Macron made the announcements yesterday threatening to leave if they decided to follow certain routes of like Islamic Republic, etc. We have to remind ourselves that the victims here are local population, are the locals, are the Malians, are the Nigerians, are the Burkinabes, and the people in the region. These groups have not demonstrated capabilities or intention to carry attacks on the West. While they pose a threat to citizens in this area, as the security forces operate in the area, they have not demonstrated the capability or intention to go across the Mediterranean and carry attacks. So this is a local problem. So we have to find a strategy that is going to work for the local partners more than trying to work for the international community. Joint collaboration will be key, and this goes to the point of rethinking strategy on negotiations with jihadists. Like France is totally against it. The Malians are open to it. Either will like it or not. Negotiations are already taking place. Talks are already taking, the local communities are already taking matters into their own hands. As I mentioned earlier, they already achieved accords with the jihadists in some areas. And because they have done that, their people are able now to return to their normal life. They're able to go to the local markets to have access to food and water, etc. So life kind of returning to some normality, while under the state has not been the case. Another thing to think of, the last point, and I'll stop here. Something that the international community could do going forward is when stabilization returned after the international community should do its best to prevent massacres against those communities that are trying to strike deal with jihadists, because they struck deals because they found themselves forced to. So they opted out of fighting these groups so they could survive. So when you can see when the state returns to these areas or security forces return there, they are automatically going to stigmatize those local communities because they're going to accuse them of collaborating with jihadists. And there is a history there of atrocities against local communities perceived of collaborating with jihadists. So anything the international community could do to prevent that from happening in the coming years when stabilization returns, that I think that's one point should be included in the strategy. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot for your remarks, especially for your point about the accountability of the Western forces in the battles against the insurgency, and your point about the security provider for the local communities, so they don't need to ask for security to the jihadist groups. Delina, do you agree about the political implications of instability in Mali and Chad, and why some EU countries are more involved than others in the Sahel region? Do you think that the French-led intervention is working? What about the new task force, the Takuba Special Force Task Force implemented since last year, and what are the implications at the domestic level for the European Union counterterrorism strategy in Africa? As Rida mentioned, Macron had sent some messages about a possible withdrawal of Barkhane troops, or at least a reduction of the troops due to the situation in Mali. Please.
Thank you. Grazie, Matteo. I couldn't agree more with Rida. Extremely well put, good points. I think it would make sense to mention a few very brief developments in the region, which could then clarify some of the things I'm going to say later. So the new European Sahel strategy has just been launched. It happened in April after 10 years since the last Sahel strategy. And as all of this was happening, Chadian President Idriss Déby was assassinated while they say fighting rebels in the north. And his son took power in what we can effectively call a coup. Most recently, as we all certainly know, another military coup took place in Mali, a coup within a coup, effectively, because another coup had occurred in August last year. So this new EU Sahel strategy presents some really positive developments. It calls for better accountability with Sahelian leaders, something that is also reaching the EU Foreign Policy Chief Borrell, who recently said that the EU may have signed too many blank checks to African leaders. And secondly, the strategy also calls for a better provision of services to Sahelian citizens, which is also something that is very relevant and is very much connected to what Rida was mentioning, the fact that people call someone else when they are lacking security provided by their national forces, or in some cases, they are attacked by national forces. So there are many questions, however good this strategy may be, there are many questions on how to first implement it, especially on accountability, without meddling in the internal affairs of Sahelian leaders, but also on whether we will actually end up having a political strategy that is bent to the needs of a security one. This is definitely the case with France, which of course is conducting counterterrorism operations in the region, which have definitely the upper hand on the political relations with their interlocutors in the Sahel. And this is relevant because France is leading the EU on their Sahel portfolio, but also because within the EU, there are increasing talks around strategic autonomy, a new European peace facility, and also European Defence Fund. So there is a danger that a political strategy will be bent to the needs of a security one. Now, why is this dangerous? Why is this problematic? first of all, there have been many instances of abuses committed by the Malian armed forces. Almost a third of abuses, in fact, are committed by national forces, as a recent MINUSMA report demonstrated. Secondly, there are instances of funds being diverted from soldiers into the pockets of Sahelian elites that are leading these soldiers. Thirdly, of course, there are ethnic competition dynamics, as was mentioned by my colleagues, which we are failing to recognize fully. And thirdly, well, as a fourth point, I'm sorry, we keep calling for protection of civilians. And of course, as Rida mentioned, is if abuses that we commit, but also the Malian armed forces, for example, if all these abuses go unpunished, then how do we expect Sahelian leaders to actually implement stronger protection of civilians mechanisms? And lastly, and I suppose this is the main point, by being there, by being present without questioning the way we're intervening, we strengthen regimes which have a very strong military component precisely because of this emergency security threat logic. I think it makes sense and is very important to mention that citizens in the Sahel, but also military components of military forces in the Sahel have a way of making their voices heard. They can do this through protests or through coups. But they also do this through an increasing number of people joining armed groups. And so, for example, in places like Bunti or around Bunti currently, people are not just saddened because of unjustified and unjustifiable losses of lives, but they're also angry, and people do have agency, and this agency can be demonstrated in different ways. I think all of this is important because as the EU is talking about deploying security missions to places like Mozambique, there is a need for strong political strategies, strong conditionality mechanisms, and analysis that are very much aware of the complex political context. So what next? And this is the recommendation, the answer to your recommendation question, Matteo. The EU, with its Sahel strategy, has identified a way forward. There is very little to criticize with respect to what this strategy looks like. Mutual accountability and provision of services to all citizens is very relevant and to be praised. But how do we carry out all of this without making the same mistakes that we've been making in the past? First of all, I suppose, and this connects to my first presentation on remote warfare, a larger presence in the region is necessary, but this can be done through civilian advisors, for example, and not just a military presence, which of course is necessary in areas such as the Lipta Kugurma. Secondly, there is a need for joint military planning between military and civilian actors with the aid of local leaders or informants in order to access a specific territory and provide these basic services. And thirdly, there is a need for monitoring and evaluation mechanisms to our operations. All of this, of course, happens, but there is a lack of a learning component. So there is a lack of changing our strategy and having our strategy evolve when we realize that something isn't working. This, of course, means that there are larger costs, which should be devoted to stronger monitoring and evaluation mechanisms. Of course, being coherent in our strategy is also relevant. We cannot behave in one way towards the coup in Chad and then politically criticize the second coup in Mali. This means that people like, for example, Assimi Goïta, who in Mali led coup number 1 and number 2, will look at Chad and expect nothing from the EU or from France, no change in strategy, because we are behaving in ways that are so incoherent. And I'm going to make one last point, which I think deserves to be mentioned in this context. From a communication point of view, we constantly mention in the EU that security in Europe and security in the Sahel are closely interlinked. We mentioned that the Sahel is this new laboratory to our foreign policy. And we keep saying that the terrorist threat is the main problem in the region. By doing so, and by adding to this hysteria around migration, we definitely aren't deploying the right communication strategy. What is arriving at the ears of Sahelian leaders is that we are extremely worried and frankly slightly hysterical around certain issues. And so they may have this blank check that Borrell was warning against. I hope this is enough. I'm sorry for not mentioning Takuba. Of course, Takuba is operating in the tri-border area mostly, will be operating more massively in the future.
It's okay.
Yeah, thank you. Too lengthy.
It's okay, no worries. I've got some questions from the public, so I'll go with the first one for Aaron Zelin. So what about the presence of Ansar Sharia in Libya? To what extent are the militias and jihadist groups in Libya likely to undermine the ongoing peace process and post-conflict recovery?
Ansar Sharia in Libya hasn't been active for a number of years now. It more or less disbanded as a consequence of two things. First, many of its members, as well as some leaders, ended up joining up with the Islamic State in 2014 and 15. And then after Khalifa Haftar began his operations against Benghazi and Derna, more or less as a consequence of him destroying both cities, many people were killed, including members of the organization. So Ansar Sharia in Libya itself isn't active anymore. I mean, the only real active groups in Libya are ISIS, which, as I mentioned before, is severely degraded and barely able to operate in the central southern part of Libya. And then AQIM to a lesser extent, but AQIM hasn't really used Libya as a place to conduct attacks. They mainly use it as a place to rest, to move fighters between different countries, or to sort of facilitate and move weapons and things like that. So, compared to 5, 6, 7 years ago, the issues related to jihadism are not sort of the number one problems within Libya. It's more the political process, and then any of the outside militias related to countries trying to influence that political process. But that's beyond my own specialty, since I just focus on the jihadists. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. I've got a question for Rida Lyammouri about basically how groups like ISIS in the Islamic State in Greater Sahel and the Islamic State in West Africa, how they get the funds to finance their operations. I mean, with illicit trafficking and other kind of activities.
That's $1 million question. I think there are also it's very hard to quantify where the major source is for their to finance their operations. But I think it's safe to say it's a combination of a lot of things. As we know that historically in the Sahel, kidnapping for ransoms have been a source for income for Al Qaeda's affiliates, AQIM, later GNM. And continues to be. Like GNM just allegedly generated an income from the exchange of the release of latest hostages about I think it was October of 2020. They are still they are holding. Recently, they kidnapped a French journalist, Dubois, who's a friend of mine, and I hope he's going to be released soon. So they continue to rely on that. But I would say for ISGS, they rely more on the local economies and the informal economy, all sorts of trafficking. It's really difficult to confirm, but I hear, and a lot of experts that follow the region, they benefit from artisanal gold mining along the borders between Niger and Burkina Faso. They have a role to play in the thefts of cattle and trade of cattle, livestock trade on that border, especially between northern Benin, Niger, northern Togo, and Burkina Faso, and a little bit of on the west Nigeria. Around Lake Chad as well, they are heavily involved in all sorts of trade, especially illicit goods, not necessarily drugs trafficking, but more of trades of livestock and other goods. That's how they generate their income, in addition to the collection of contribution, for sometimes forced and sometimes is voluntary from the communities. This is not to say that communities are supporting these actors, but as I mentioned earlier, they are forced. They're finding themselves. They have to collaborate by providing those contributions to the armed actors in exchange for, in some cases, the protection, like providing security, providing other services. And we see repeated, especially around the Lake Chad Basin for the ISWAP. We are seeing videos where they are providing all sorts of governance services, and this is not recent. They have been doing this for 3 or 4 years. So that's how they generate some of that income from donations as well as a collection of taxes. And I would not get into that, but there's a confusion with the zakat, and so I would not get into that. But that's, I would say, that those are the sources, but it's really hard to quantify and to say with certainty, like, what are the main sources of income. Sorry, one point I forgot to mention, but also the ransacking of military bases. I think they do a lot of their weapons in recent years. They're not coming from Libya. They're not coming from Turkey or somewhere else. They are coming from the military bases they ransack. When you look at the videos they release after they ransack a my army base, I mean, they don't need to smuggle weapons from anywhere else. They can just rely on that, and that has been one of the key conflict driver between the Islamic State, ISGS, and JNM, Al-Qaeda affiliates in the Sahel. The share, how they could divide this, what they capture from ransacking of military bases. So that's what I have to say about that.
Thanks a lot for this very interesting insights about the financing techniques of these groups. And to go back to Delina for so she can elaborate a bit more about, as she said, about the Takuba task force, but also she mentioned the role of civilian advisors to the overall strategy of the European Union in the region. And I would like to ask her also, what do you think the European Union agencies like Frontex could do in that context? You know, they are training some local police and local law enforcement. And do you foresee an additional role for the European Union agencies? Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, on the last question, the operations in terms of security sector reform, which are mostly conducted by our internal security forces that are then sent to the region to provide trainings for example, the Nigerian police. All of this at the level of the EU is very well monitored. I mean, there are good indicators in place. This work isn't as problematic as that of security forces, which then are the ones that lead on coups. What is missing there, and this is something that we should certainly improve, is precisely what I mentioned earlier. So this idea of having a learning tool where whenever programming doesn't work, I mean, the amount of projects that are currently carried out in the Sahel is crazy. There is an amount of money being spent and an amount of programming that is currently underway that we could improve, because we are investing a lot. The problem is that we don't seem to change our programming based on the input from the ground. And in many instances, conversations with colleagues at UCAP, for example, which is the EU civilian mission, which is both located in, there is a RAC in Mauritania, but is also in Niger and Mali. Conversations with them often point to a lack of listening capacity on the part of Brussels. So there is this communication gap between what is happening in the region and what we from Brussels understand of it. And then, on Takuba. So Takuba is an emergency mission, is truly an exception counterterrorism special forces operation, and it operates on a fairly fast-paced day-to-day emergency conditions. So of course, following the coups in Chad and in Mali, I don't think Takuba should be suspended. Otherwise, the situation in the tri-border area would truly be problematic. But I think the way we provide assistance to, for example, security, military forces, but also the day-to-day conduct of operations of the EU training mission to Mali, all of this should be suspended until negotiations are underway for a transition government that is led by a civilian figure that is not abiding by the rules of the military. But maybe that is too much to ask for.
Thanks a lot, Delina. Does any of the speakers have anything to add, in particular, any point? We are running out of time, so thank you very much. Thanks, Delina Goxho. Thanks, Rida Lyammouri, and thanks, Dr. Aaron Zelin, for taking part in this ISPI panel about the evolving nature of ISIS in Africa and the Middle East. I hope our viewers and followers enjoyed this event and learned something new as I did. Thanks for watching, and don't miss our next events, including the MED conference in Rome in December. Bye.
Bye, thank you.